pray as we go to our classes that we dig into your word and better our lives in service to you. Pray that continue to watch over those that are on our minds that are dealing with different illnesses and struggles in their life. And pray that you watch over those that are traveling and get them back here safely. Thank you for all you do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Go faster, Dad.
Everybody get a handout. We'll be getting to that here fairly quick, I think, today. Everybody have a pretty good weekend. It's been really nice weather, I'll tell you that. It was like, I think it was 40 this morning, close to it. It was really nice.
Plus you're outside a t-shirt.
I was.
I can't help that. I was frozen.
Oh, wait, we gotta make note of that. You were froze.
Must be old age, don't have anything.
You said it.
I don't want to join that club.
I can help you with that.
All right. Okay, we made it to chapter 8 of Acts. We were looking at the persecution, talking about Paul, looking at the persecution that had happened. I think we got down to verse 3, and we were talking about Paul again and some of the havoc that he was causing in the church. Verse 2, Stephen was buried and buried by devout men, which is more than likely Christians who noticed, saw this happen and wanted to make sure that he was buried. And so we get to verse 3, chapter 8. It says, and as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. And so, Paul is trying to destroy the church. The word havoc means to treat shamefully or with injury, to ravage, devastate, to ruin. It's this idea of a wolf or a lion just ripping apart somebody or something. You think of havoc, you think of that ripping apart. It's kind of like in the account of Daniel in the lion's den. When he was taken out and those that had made that decree that were deceitful and trying to kill Daniel were thrown into the pit, it said that they were dismembered, they were completely just destroyed, ripped apart before they even touched the bottom of the chamber. And that's how vicious they were. And so that's the idea here of what Paul was doing. Paul was just trying everything he could to destroy the church. And so he raged against the church like a wild beast. Something interesting that I found in this study, Kaufman is a commentator. He's a member of the church, actually, Kaufman. He made this statement about this time. He says, about year AD 37, there was no Roman governor in Jerusalem for a time. And as Bowles said, which is another commentator, the Jewish factions reigned supreme. The opponents of Christianity thrust men and women into vile prisons and brought them before elders in the synagogues, who tried to force them to deny Jesus. Upon their refusal, some of them were put to death, others beaten, and all suffered many outrages. And so, according to history, during this time, there was no Roman rulers. There was a lapse in the governors. And so, the Jewish factions at that time, which would have been the Sanhedrin, Those, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and things like that, they were reigning in this area because they were under Roman control. But, because you think about with Christ, they had Felix, or no, with Paul you had Felix, but you had Herod, you had Pilate, things like that, who were governors of that area. And it wasn't all of Jerusalem given to one. Herod only controlled certain areas of Jerusalem, or of Israel. Then you had Pilate who controlled another separate area. And so when we're talking about this time, it was just kind of a perfect time for the Jews, you think about it that way, for them to be able to wreak havoc upon Christianity. And so it kind of explains what happened with the Sanhedrin, because you don't see the Jewish factions or the Pharisees being authorized to kill someone. They didn't do that. They allowed the Romans to do it. But yet now we're seeing this happen where the Jews are killing. They are trying to do everything they can to stop it. And so it must have fit in that time period where there was no governor. And so Paul was trying to do everything he could to stop the church. And so then we get to verse 4. It says, "Therefore those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word." And I think it's interesting, it's understandable what the Christians were doing. And we talked a little bit about this last week. They fled to safer areas. There was nothing wrong with them fleeing. If we had a great persecution happening here in Eagleville, where we are losing our lives, people are dying for their faith, I wouldn't stay here. Wouldn't want to. Partly because I've got to worry about my family. I don't want my family suffering those persecutions. And so you think about it, it's like, we don't have that problem here, but you think about that in the Middle East. There's people that live in the Middle East, they still choose to stay there, and that's fine. We notice that the people were fleeing, but who stayed in Jerusalem? Who stayed in this area, as we'd already mentioned? The apostles. The apostles chose to stay, and so they were rightful in doing that. But you had many Christians just spread out throughout the world, spread throughout really through the area, but also into many other areas. And so they fled to safer areas to live. So there's nothing wrong if we had that happen to us here, in this country. But what difference here is they didn't let the persecution stop them from what? Yeah. As they fled to other areas, they still spoke about Christ. They still spoke about the gospel. They didn't stop. They didn't want to die physically, so they fled. They didn't want to be persecuted, but it didn't stop them from spreading the gospel. But notice, this is something, kind of goes along with our Sunday night class. This means that not just men were spreading the gospel, but women also. Both were. It didn't say just men fled. It said the Christians fled, the people fled. And they both were out still spreading the gospel. And so, let's see, what was verse 4? It says they were scattered and were preaching the word. The word preaching there, this is the word to announce good news, to evangelize. This is not the same word as we see in verse 5. Next verse is Philip went down to the city of Samaria and preached Christ to them. This is a different Greek word. Now in English, this is just like English. We use the same word to mean different things. Now we have the word evangelize, and that's where this word that's used in verse 4 is. It's someone that's evangelizing. It's someone that's spreading the news. When you get to verse 5, and it's talking about what Philip is doing, he is heralding the message. He is actually out preaching, in that position of preaching, and that's when we see that word used. And so here the people are evangelizing, but it's different from what we see. And that's similar to 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2. So how did they do this spreading of the good news? Of course, they're evangelizing, but there's something key in this verse. As they go along, I think the King James says it a little differently. New King James says everywhere. But as they went along, they spread the gospel. What does that mean? What does that sound like?
Covering area.
Okay, covering an area. Yeah, they were making sure the gospel was going throughout the world, which is what God wanted. What else? Yeah, they weren't being shut up. Yeah, that's right. But think about it and applying it, which both those things apply to us too. But think about it in your life, my life, whatever the case may be. As they went along in their life, they were speaking about Christ. As they went along, they were spreading the gospel. So it wasn't, standing on the street corner and proclaiming the message, or a man standing up here and teaching class or preaching. That's not what he's talking about here. This was in their daily life. And so it would be when you're at your job, when you're at the grocery store, things like that. People that you talk to, it's professing the good message, the good news to people. They spread as they move from place to place, where they worked, etc. And that's what we're seeing here. All right, any questions on that? All right, let's somebody read verse 5 through 8, please.
Then Philip went down to the city of Samaria and preached Christ to them. And the multitudes with one accord heeded the things spoken by Philip, hearing and seeing the miracles which he did. For unclean spirits, crying out with loud voice, came out of many who were possessed, and many who were paralyzed and lame were healed. And there was a great joy in the city.
All right, so now we're starting to talk about Philip. And really, the whole chapter is focused on Philip except for the first 4 verses. And Philip here, he is now going into Samaria, which is the next step into what God wanted to happen in Acts chapter 1. So let me read Acts 1 and verse 8, just to remind us.
That ye shall receive power after that the Holy Ghost is come upon you, and you shall be witnesses unto me both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and in Samaria and unto the uttermost part of the earth.
All right, so this is step 3 of what Christ wanted. First, it was Jerusalem. That was Acts chapter 2 through roughly, verse or chapter 4 or 5. Then you have Judea, which is the area around Jerusalem. This would be the southern half of the kingdom. Then you have the gospel now, chapter 8, is going into Samaria. Now, what is significant about Samaria? You guys remember much about what Samaria is? Did the Jews like them? The Jews did not like them. The Jews hated them. And matter of fact, most of the time you see the Jews go around Samaria. They would cross the ocean, or not the ocean, the Jordan River, go into a heathen country, go north, and cross back over just to not go through Samaria. Now, is that something that we saw Jesus do? No, he went right through Samaria. Matter of fact, if he didn't, we wouldn't have John chapter 4. If we didn't, we wouldn't have the sons of thunder. That the phrase for Peter, or for John and James, yes, who wanted God to rain fire down upon the Samaritans and kill them. And so here we have Philip, who is who, as we're going to see, he's one of the men from chapter 6. More than likely is one of the men from chapter 6 that was selected to take care of the widows in need.
But wasn't he a Samaritan or a mixed race Samaritan?
I think he could have been a proselyte into Judaism, and many believe he was a Hellenist, which we talked about. That means he was from another area, so he would have been a Jew from Egypt or whatever the case may be, wherever the Grecian areas were at that time. And so that I think that's important because they chose men who could take care of those widows that were the Hellenists of that group. And so more than likely he wasn't full-blood Jew. And so I think that helps in what Philip is doing and going in Samaria. I'm going to read Acts 21 and verse 8. I'm kind of jumping around a little bit on my outline, but Acts 21 and verse 8.
The next day we, with Paul's companions, departed from Caesarea and entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him.
All right, so here Philip is mentioned again, and he is called to Philip the evangelist. So most of the time that's what we refer to him as, because he doesn't get that title for just no reason. He definitely was an evangelist, and that was his focus in life. And so he would have fit well in this area. He was very evangelistic. And, the fact that he cared about going into Samaria showed, his heart. And not only that, when we get to the end of chapter 8, he is speaking to the Ethiopian eunuch, who is a proselyte from Ethiopia, who was not allowed to go into the court of the temple because he wasn't a full-blood Jew. And so he's definitely reaching out to other people than just the Jews, which is great. And we see in chapter 10, the gospel now goes to the rest of the world, which is us, and which is amazing. And so here it tells us in verse 5 that Philip went down to Samaria and preached Christ to them. That's an interesting statement. Have you ever heard anybody say that we need to be preaching Christ? Did anybody tell you that? I've had some preachers, denominational preachers, tell me that we just need to be preaching Christ. What do they mean by that?
His love.
Exactly.
And they don't mean his true love. They mean what makes you feel good about your faith.
Yeah. What they mean is we need to just be preaching about the love of Christ, his sacrifice for us, what he has done for us, and just focus on that. Was that what Philip was doing? Now, is that a part of preaching Christ? Yes, 100%. But as we see as we go through this chapter, if he was just preaching that idea of Christ, why do we have people repenting of their sins and being baptized? What else does that include? He was heralding the message of Christ. And so somebody read Acts 8 and look at verse 12 now.
But when they believed Philip as he preached the things concerning the kingdom of God and the name of Jesus Christ, both men and women were baptized.
Does it mean, you think about that passage, we'll talk about it a little bit more too later. He was preaching about the kingdom, he was preaching about Christ. Those two things together cause people to be baptized. Does a person just become baptized because they just think they need, just because they I'm trying to think of a way to say this, just to do it out of just the need to, or want to, or I don't know if that's the right way to say it. Let's say it this way. They have to know they need to do something to be baptized. And that's the example we see in Acts chapter 2. Everywhere the message is repent and be baptized, Acts 2 and 38. And so if these people were hearing Christ and were being baptized, they were hearing the gospel. Somebody read Romans 15, verse 4. I kind of want to talk about this a minute, just what it means to preach Christ, because I think it's important. Romans 15 and verse 4.
For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope.
All right, so the things that are written before time were, for one, for our learning, and for two, so we can have hope. Hope of what? Yeah, of heaven, of eternity. And with that means that teaching the Old Testament teaches about Christ. Teaching the Old Testament means teaching about the need and seeing how the people of the Old Testament sinned and did the things they should not have done, and shows us about God, shows his character. There's so much about it. So preaching Christ means he is also preaching from the Old Testament and showing that, which is what we've seen in Acts chapter 2, what we've seen with Stephen. He did that. He went to the Old Testament and preached about Christ and to show who Christ was. Somebody read Acts 8 now in verse 35 and through 38.
Then Philip opened his mouth and began at the same scripture and preached unto him Jesus. And as they went on their way, they came unto a certain water, and the eunuch said, See, here is water. What doth hinder me to be baptized? And Philip said, If thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And he commanded the chariot to stand still, and they went down both into the water, both Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him.
All right, so here you have the eunuch, which we'll talk about this more later, but the eunuch was looking at Isaiah, and he was reading from Isaiah, and he didn't understand who it was talking about. What did Philip do? Straighten him out. From that scripture, taught him Christ. And after he started from there, taught him about Christ, the first thing that we see from the eunuch is, I need to be baptized. He understood in that what? What does that include? What does that imply with him hearing about Christ and knowing he needed to be baptized? The plan of salvation. He understood that he wasn't living the way God wanted him to live. He understood he had sin in his life. He understood that there was a better path, that if he wanted to go to heaven, he had to be on that path. And so it includes all of those things. And so he preached to him about salvation. And so preaching Christ is not just about Christ's love and his sacrifice, but our need to change to be pleasing to him. That's preaching Christ. Somebody read Ephesians 1 and verse 3.
Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ.
Okay, preaching about Christ also means we preach about the promises and the rewards. The promises of those that are obedient to him, that follow and are pleasing to living a life of righteousness, and the rewards that come with it. And so that is included. Somebody read 1 Peter 1, 13 through 16.
Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, and be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, not conforming themselves to the former lust, as in your ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, but also be holy in all your conduct. Because it is written, Be holy, for I am holy.
Preaching Christ is preaching that we have to be holy. We need to be holy. And that means following his commands. That means obeying the gospel. That it means changing some things in our lives. That's more than just teaching about the love of Christ. That's teaching us that I need to do something. I need to make a change. Ephesians chapter 1, 22 and 23, somebody please.
And that he put all things under his feet, and gave him to be the head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him that filleth all in all.
All right, so preaching about Christ means we're preaching about the church, the kingdom. And then one more, Ephesians 2 and verse 10.
For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them.
All right, so we are his workmanship. That means we are to be molded for his service. That means we preach about the responsibilities that we have as Christians, the duties that we have to God. And so, yes, they're right. We need to preach Christ. But what are they really saying when they say we just need to be preaching Christ? We just need to preach what feels good to everybody. That's what it is. We need to preach what makes people feel good about the situation they're in, the life that they're in, and preach about things that encourage them to continue on. Those are important things to do, but that's not all the gospel. That's not all the message. You think about the prophets. You had prophets that encouraged the people to continue in a path that they were doing. Not very many, because they weren't in a very good position, the Jews at that time. But you had most of the time was making correction. You know, Paul, I love how Paul writes, because Paul always starts his letters out with encouraging things and telling them how much he loves them, how much he's thinking about them, how much he's praying for them. And he encourages them in the things that they're doing right. But then he gets into, okay, now there's some things you need to fix. Every person has something to fix. I have things to fix. Every one of us do. And so we can't just always hear, oh, we're doing great, continue doing, whatever state we're in. No, we need the both. We need all of it. That's the scriptures for 2 Timothy 3, verse 16 and 17. For correction, for reproof, for instruction in righteousness. It encourages us to do better. And so we need to be preaching Christ, but we need to be doing it in the way that they were doing here. That's exactly what we saw in Acts 2 and many other places. When I think of just preaching what people want to hear, I think about some of the false prophets of the Old Testament who would tell some of the evil kings of that time that, oh yeah, just do what you want, you'll be fine. I think of Elijah going to, I can't remember what king it was one of the kings of the north, one of the wicked kings, and telling him not to go fight in this battle because he would die. And his prophets were like, oh, they're good, you're good, you'll be fine, God's going to be with you. And he was wrong. They were wrong. And so we got to be careful about that. All right, so preaching Christ, and that's what we see here. He was preaching Christ, and people were changing their lives because of it. And so let's notice, verse 6 now. It says, and the multitudes with one accord heeded the things spoken by Philip, hearing and seeing the miracles which he did. And so he was preaching Christ to them. The people heeded the things that Philip said. And what caused them to listen? The word heeded here, word study says, is to hold their mind or the ear towards someone, to pay attention. As a nautical term, it means to hold a ship in a direction to sail towards. And so it means to hold on one's course toward a place. So they had fixed their minds. It says ears here, but it's a figure of speech. Yeah, they were paying attention. They were focused on going one direction, and that direction was towards God. And so with wanting to be pleasing toward God, they were listening to what they needed to do to be pleasing to him, and they heeded that. You got to remember, this is a group of people who were mostly were wicked. You think about the Samaritan woman. She'd been married 7 times. She was an outcast in her society, and they weren't like the Jews. They weren't like the Jews. Some of the Jews were very hypocritical. That's what Jesus was talking about with the Pharisees. But many of the Jews that the message was preached to, they were striving to live a life pleasing to God under the old law. We're getting now to a people who were more like us before we became Christians, in a sense, who were not maybe living a life that God was pleased with. And they hear that their life is not right, and they change. And so they were focused on that. They were focused on that growing. The people of Samaria, if they did worship God, they only listened to the Pentateuch. What is the Pentateuch? Remember what that is? Yeah, it's the law. The first 5 books of the Old Testament. That's all they had. They didn't have a lot of the other books because they chose not to. They would only listen to just some of what the Pentateuch stated. And so they were just different than what a lot of the Jews were. We're seeing that. And so they had a desire to want to hear the message, and that built a faith in God. Romans 10, verse 17, which we know that means. And so the miracles helped cause them to listen. And look what that did. Verse 7. It says, "For unclean spirits crying with a loud voice came out of many who were possessed, and many who were paralyzed and lame were healed." Here, which I think is really interesting, remember, who is Luke? What was his profession? He was a doctor. And so when Luke brings up things about miracles, he always uses some of those medical terms. And here he uses some of these medical terms that a lot of places they don't. A lot of the other writers do not. And it's interesting, he distinguishes between those that were sick. He says those that had palsies and those that were lame. What is the difference? Well, lame is they just were not able to walk. It could be because of a deformity. It could have been from something being broke. Palsies is a effect upon somebody's nerves. And so he distinguishes between the two. Most of the time we see lame being used just in reference to both. But Luke, and so that's just something interesting that I think is fun about Luke's writing. But you have the sick being healed. So you have people that are lame, people that have been dealing with these tremors in their nerves their whole lives or for a long period of time being healed. But not only that, they had spirits that were causing great things or terrible things happening to the people in this area. It says, unclean spirits crying with a loud voice came out of many who were possessed. Could you imagine that? You had this violent demon possession that was going on to some of these people. I think about the different times Jesus healed some possessed people. One was living in a cemetery who was terrible. I mean, he was out wreaking havoc to the people that came by. And so here you have these very evil spirits are being ripped out or taken out of these people. What do you think that's going to do to the community seeing that?
Reinforces it.
Yeah, what is miracle supposed to do? Yeah, confirm the message. Philip's preaching a message, then he turns around and confirms it with this power that was given to him by God. It's going to show that this definitely had to come from God. This message was from God, and they would hear it. And so it appealed to their eyes because they saw these things happen, and it appealed to their ears and because it confirmed what they heard. Now, we don't have miracles today, but how do we appeal to our eyes and our ears in the message today? We hear it, okay? It may be through someone teaching it, through classes, somebody saying something to you. How do we confirm it with our eyes? Study it. You know, yeah, we're not going to have these miracles that we see happen in front of us, but we can pick up the Word of God and confirm, because we can first have that. You got to think about this. When they saw the miracles, they had to decide, okay, that had to be from God.
Is that the difference between them and Simon, who also, before he didn't have the message? Is that the difference? Because
Yeah.
he amazed them also with supposedly healing people.
Yeah, exactly. He was using trickery, which And it was amazing, the people.
The
Yeah.
message.
But he didn't have the message. Yeah, that's right. He was using trickery to appeal to their eyes, and they thought it was amazing. And yet, but he wasn't telling them the truth. Yeah, he wasn't living a life that was right. But he changed that. Thankfully, what we see there.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, I would think it would be hard to get people to change their mind to say this is from God when they were witnessing what Simon was doing. I could see confusion going on.
Mm-hmm.
But the message wasn't there
Yeah.
that was being preached, I suppose would be the difference.
I think you're right. I didn't think about that, but yeah, he didn't have the message, so that would be the difference. Because yeah, we're gonna see as we talk about Simon, the same words are used there in the amazement that people had of what Simon was doing, and the amazement that he had in seeing the things being done too. So yeah, I think it was the same thing, except for the message. And so, verse 8 tells us that. And there was great joy in that city. They had not seen these things happen. Where did Jesus do and the apostles do their ministry originally? What was we call it the small commission or the little commission. I think that's the word for it. The first commission, not the great commission. We call the Acts 20 or 28 verse 19 through 20 the great commission. Where did Jesus, Matthew 28, where did Jesus tell his disciples to go after the death of John the Baptist? To Judea.
Limited.
It was a limited commission. There you go, that's the word I was looking for. It was a limited commission. He told them to go to the Jews. They didn't perform a lot of these miracles and things in front of the Samaritans, in the area of Samaria. And so here, they're seeing these miraculous things being done. They're amazed, they're hearing the message, and they're listening. And so there was a great joy. The people had a great joy. You can imagine not having to deal with some of these possessed people that were living in their midst. You saw all these people being healed, their family, their friends. It caused great growth. Margie?
Why in the Old Testament like that? Did they have the evil spirits did God put it there for the miracles for people to believe that we don't have today?
I think it is. I really do. I've thought about that too, because you don't really see it under the Old Testament as much. You don't see this demon possession. The only time, and I may be wrong, but the only time I've seen the demon possession was during the time of Christ and the apostles. And so to me, that would point to this was something that God could show his power over. Because who did the demons serve? Satan. We see that with Jesus when the demons spoke to him. They understood who he was. They understood that they served Satan. And then when Jesus was questioned that he was the son of Beelzebub, he's like, why would Satan cast out his own? He wouldn't do that. So they and the people knew that the demons served Satan. So I think that's just another miraculous thing here, showing of God's power. He had control over Satan. He had control over the demons. Well, it is around Halloween, but
Me too, they got white tails and they jump out from my car.
yeah. But we don't see the demon possession today, and I don't really remember seeing it in the Old Testament. I may be wrong, but I don't remember.
The only time I can recall someone from the Old Testament not being in their right mind was when Nebuchadnezzar's mind was taken from him and he had to go live out in the grass.
Yeah.
That's,
We see that. We also see God sending troubling spirits to cause a person mental problems because of their way they were living, or cause them problems. But that's God doing that, and he's not going to send a demon. He's going to cause something to trouble them.
would that be the case with Saul whenever he went and consulted with the lady who said she could talk to spirits and then he bothered Samuel?
I don't know. You do have, that's an interesting account because she was shocked when Samuel started talking to her. And I think the reason is because she was deceiving people and it actually worked that time. And yeah, so she was like, oh wow, he is talking. I can do this. Well, it was God allowing it to happen. So yeah, go read that account. It's pretty interesting. She's shocked herself when Samuel starts to speak. And so she was one that was living a life of just trickery, kind of like Simon was living. So, all right, anything else on this? We're out of time.
Verse 7, for what it's worth, mine translates that those who were paralyzed and lame. So I don't know if that fits.
New King James is paralyzed, but the word, King James is palsy,
Okay.
and that's the word. The word in the Greek means it's a cause of a nerve damage. Tremors. If you look up palsy today, that's what it is. It's a tremors through the nerves. So it could like affect somebody's legs, whatever the case may be, where they are paralyzed from it. So, but it's a different medical term. All right, anything else? All right, we'll pick up here. Next week is Fifth Sunday. I got that right this month, I think. And so we'll be in the next couple weeks. We'll pick up here.